There is something deeply wrong with the painting you think you know. Not wrong in the way art critics argue about brushwork, not wrong in the way conspiracy theorists argue about Mary Magdalene, wrong in a way that nobody in the mainstream is talking about clearly enough, wrong in a way that started becoming visible when modern scientists began peeling apart the physical layers of this mural using technology that did not exist even 20 years ago. And what they found underneath stopped several of them cold. The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci is not what it appears to be. And I do not mean that poetically. I mean that literally, physically, chemically, and structurally, the painting conceals layers that Leonardo himself never wanted the public to fully understand. Some of those layers are hidden beneath the visible paint. Some are hidden in the chemistry of the materials he chose. And some are hidden in choices he made that historians spent centuries calling mistakes, until science finally proved they were anything but. But here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you before we go any further. The face you see when you look at Christ in the Last Supper is not the face Leonardo painted. The eyes were moved, the mouth was altered, beards were added to apostles who had none. Hands were lengthened and flattened. The dimensions of multiple heads were physically changed. The painting hanging on that wall in Milan, the one that millions of people have stood in front of with tears in their eyes, is not Leonardo's painting. It is a forgery built on top of a forgery built on top of what remains of the original. And underneath all of it, according to scientists working with the most advanced imaging tools on Earth, there are things Leonardo did that no one has been able to fully explain. Let us start from the beginning, because the beginning is where the first strange decision was made. In 1495, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, to paint a mural inside the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie. A refectory is a dining hall. Dominican monks ate their meals in that room every single day. The symbolism was very deliberate. Place the image of Christ's final meal on the wall of a room where men of God eat their meals. Let sacred history and present reality inhabit the same space. That was the commission. That was the assignment. Leonardo accepted it, and immediately made a decision that made no sense at all. He refused to use traditional fresco technique. Fresco painting requires working on wet plaster. You apply the pigment quickly while the surface is still damp, and as it dries, the paint bonds chemically with the wall. It becomes almost part of the wall itself. It lasts for centuries. Every major mural painter of Leonardo's era used fresco. It was the standard, the proven, the safe method. Leonardo had watched other painters use it. He understood exactly how it worked and exactly why it worked. He chose something different anyway. He painted on dry plaster. He used tempera and oil paints applied directly to a surface that could not chemically absorb and lock them in. He knew this was unstable. He had to have known. He was one of the most scientifically precise minds of his century. He understood material properties the way modern engineers understand load-bearing calculations. This was not ignorance. This was not impatience. This was a deliberate choice to use a method that would allow him to paint slowly, to revise, to rethink, to layer. And here's what that choice actually meant in practice. When you paint on dry plaster, using oil and tempera instead of fresco, you create something traditional fresco cannot create. Depth. Physical, structural depth between separate layers. The base layer sits against the wall. The middle layers sit above it. The visible surface layer sits above those. Each one is chemically distinct. Each one can theoretically contain different information. And none of them are fused together the way fresco is fused. They can be separated. They can be examined independently. They can, centuries later, be scanned by machines that detect what the human eye cannot. The paint began deteriorating within decades of completion. Some accounts say visitors noticed flaking and fading within Leonardo's own lifetime. The prior of the convent reportedly complained to Leonardo about working too slowly. Leonardo reportedly responded that he was still searching for the right face to model Judas on, and if the prior continued to bother him, he would use the prior's face. That detail has been passed down for 5 centuries as a funny story about an artist's temperament. But look at what it actually tells you. Leonardo was deliberately slowing himself down on a project he understood was already chemically unstable. He was choosing consciously to spend more time on a mural that he knew would not last. Why? Why would one of the greatest technical minds in European history choose a method almost guaranteed to decay, work slowly on it anyway, and spend extraordinary effort on precision that would eventually disappear? Unless the structure of those layers mattered more than the survival of the surface. Now add the chemistry. Scientists analyzing the Last Supper in 2023 using synchrotron X-ray diffraction and microinfrared spectroscopy found something extraordinary beneath the visible paint. Buried in the base layers of the mural, they detected a rare lead compound called plumbonacrit. They also found shannonite, another rare lead mineral, detected here for the very first time in any historical painting ever analyzed. The presence of these compounds indicates that Leonardo mixed lead oxide directly into his oil before applying the primer layer to the wall. He was essentially doing chemistry before modern chemistry existed as a formal discipline. But here is the part that researchers found strange. Lead oxide is toxic. Leonardo knew that. He mentioned lead oxide in his personal notebooks, but only in the context of skin treatments and hair remedies. There's no written record in any of his surviving notebooks where he described using it as a painting medium. He documented almost everything. He filled thousands of pages with notes on anatomy, mechanics, geometry, water flow, military engineering, music, optics. He wrote in mirror script to protect his ideas from casual readers. He kept detailed records of materials, pigments, recipes. And yet, this specific technique, this lead oxide priming method he clearly used on both The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, appears nowhere in his written records. He used it. He hid the fact that he used it. He kept doing it across multiple major works, and he never wrote it down. That is not forgetfulness. That is concealment. Now think about what lead oxide actually does to paint when applied this way. It creates a base layer with a luminous, almost pearlescent quality. Plumbonocrite nanocrystals scatter light in a way that makes surfaces above them appear to glow from within. It gives painting an inner depth that other primers cannot replicate. It was a technique so advanced that the next painter to use anything comparable was Rembrandt in the Netherlands more than a century later. Leonardo discovered it independently, used it secretly, and told no one. The man who documented everything chose not to document this. Now we reach the Restoration, because the Restoration is where things become genuinely disturbing in a different way. In 1978, a conservator named Pinin Brambilla Barcelon was working on a painting on the wall opposite the Last Supper inside the refectory. While she worked, she noticed something terrible. Fragments of paint from Leonardo's mural were literally peeling away and falling to the floor in front of her eyes. The situation was more critical than anyone had publicly acknowledged. She was appointed to lead an emergency restoration project. That project would take 21 years. What the restoration team found when they began removing the accumulated layers of previous interventions was staggering. For centuries, well-meaning restorers had painted over Leonardo's work in an attempt to preserve it, but they had no idea what was underneath. They painted over things they could not see. They changed things they did not understand. When Brambilla's team finally removed those accumulated layers of overpaint using microscopic cleaning tools, infrared reflectoscopy, and chemical analysis, they found Leonardo's original work underneath. And what they found shocked them. The faces had been changed, not damaged, changed, deliberately altered. The positions of the eyes had been moved. Mouths that Leonardo had painted slightly open had been closed by later restorers, who apparently found the expression strange or inappropriate. Beards had been added to apostles Leonardo had painted without them. The hands of several figures had been elongated and flattened. The actual physical dimensions of multiple heads had been altered. Someone, at some point in the painting's history, had looked at Leonardo's original and decided to make it different, more conventional, more familiar, more like what a painting of this scene was supposed to look like. Brambilla's statement when the restoration was revealed in 1999 was reported around the world. She said that only at that moment had the original features of the faces been discovered for the first time since the 18th century. The eyes had been altered. The mouths had been closed, the proportions had been changed. The Last Supper that people had been venerating, reproducing, analyzing, and crying in front of for generations was not Leonardo's composition. It was an edited version, a censored version, a version someone had decided was more appropriate than what Leonardo actually painted. And this triggered something enormous. If the visible faces had been changed, what else had been changed? And more importantly, what was underneath the visible layer that no one had properly examined? This is where modern technology enters the picture and makes everything more complicated. Within the last decade, imaging technology used on art has advanced to a level that would have seemed like science fiction to the restorers of the 1990s. Hyperspectral imaging can capture light wavelengths far beyond what the human eye can detect, creating data maps of a painting that reveal chemical composition, layer structure, and buried features simultaneously. AI-assisted reconstruction systems trained on Renaissance geometry and Leonardo's known compositional habits can detect structural patterns invisible to any human analyst working manually. The mural can now be examined at resolutions, capturing individual brushstrokes from 500 years ago. And what multiple research teams have reported finding when they push those tools into the Last Supper is that the mural does not behave like a normal deteriorating painting. Normal deterioration creates chaos, random fragmentation, unpredictable pigment loss, irregular structural breakdown. What researchers keep finding in the Last Supper instead is something that behaves with consistency, geometric alignments that repeat, mathematical relationships between figures that hold across damaged sections, perspective systems of extraordinary precision that appear to have been engineered, not simply applied. Leonardo hammered a single nail into the wall of that refectory to anchor the perspective system of the entire painting. Every line in the composition, the ceiling panels, The wall tapestries, the windows, the angles of the table, the architectural framing of the room, all of it converges on a single point. That point is Christ's right eye. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. The entire constructed reality of the painted room bends mathematically toward a single location in the center of the mural. Researchers who have mapped this perspective using modern precision tools describe the accuracy as almost disturbing, not because it is perfect in an aesthetic sense, but because it is perfect in an engineering sense. It functions like a designed system rather than a painted scene. Now pair that with the AI-assisted analysis findings. When reconstruction systems examine the region directly behind Christ, the most damaged section of the mural, they repeatedly detect structural anomalies that do not behave like random deterioration. Curved alignments, spacing relationships, partial mirrored structures, fragmentary forms that repeat in mathematically meaningful locations, at perspective intersections, at golden ratio alignment points, at what researchers describe as the structural nodes of the composition. The outputs are not clean. They are not a readable message, but they are consistent. They keep appearing the same way under different analysis passes, and they cluster most densely in the exact region that decades of previous analysis had dismissed as too damaged to be informative. The damaged section behind Christ also happens to be directly connected to the most significant physical loss the painting has suffered since its creation. In 1652, monks cut a doorway through the lower center of the mural to improve foot traffic through the convent. The doorway destroyed the lower central section of the painting permanently. The feet of Christ are gone. The floor beneath the table is gone. Whatever was painted in that lower central region, the geometrically most important zone of the entire composition according to reconstruction analysis, is simply absent, destroyed by people who did not know or did not care what they were removing, gone more than 150 years before modern imaging technology could have told us what was there. The mural was damaged before anyone with the tools to understand it could look closely enough. Think about what that means. If Leonardo constructed hidden structural relationships inside this painting, relationships that only become visible under modern analysis, the section most critical to those relationships is the section that was physically destroyed in 1652. Either that is an extraordinary coincidence, or someone in the 17th century understood what was in that section and made sure it disappeared. There's also the question of the apostle directly beside Christ on his right. The figure art historians have long identified as John, but which Dan Brown's novel, and a persistent segment of art researchers, have argued shows features inconsistent with male portraiture of the period. Leonardo was meticulous about facial modeling. He traveled to prisons in Milan to find a face that could model Judas, specifically searching for a person whose features expressed what he described as hardened villainy. He based each apostle's face on a real human being he had studied and observed. The level of psychological specificity in the faces of the Last Supper is unlike anything in earlier depictions of the same scene. Earlier painters depicted apostles as types. Leonardo depicted them as people. The figure beside Christ has hair rendered in a way that no other male figure in the composition shares. The facial structure has characteristics that multiple analysts have flagged as anatomically distinct from the surrounding figures. Art historian experts maintain the figure is John, pointing to the tradition of depicting John as youthful and androgynous in Last Supper imagery. That tradition is real, but Leonardo spent his career breaking tradition deliberately. He removed the halos from the apostles, something that was nearly mandatory in religious art of the period. He refused to isolate Judas on the opposite side of the table as tradition demanded. He changed the moment depicted, choosing the announcement of betrayal rather than the identification of the traitor, which was the conventional choice. Leonardo violated tradition constantly and consciously throughout this painting. Why would the figure of John be the one place he chose to follow convention blindly? There is a detail from the restoration that very few mainstream accounts properly emphasize. When Brambilla's team reached the central figures of the mural, the figure of Christ and the surrounding apostles, the pressure was so intense that she reportedly said to colleagues that all the eyes of the world who know Leonardo are watching what she does. She said some nights she could not sleep. That pressure produced something specific. The drapery on Christ's arm was altered during the 1999 restoration using fresh paint applied to stripped areas. Critics who documented this change pointed to early copies of the mural made by Leonardo's students before the centuries of damage altered the original. Those copies show Christ's sleeve tucking behind the table edge. The restoration had placed it resting on top of the table. A small change, but a change made with fresh paint on a surface claimed to be Leonardo's original. In a painting where every millimeter of surviving original pigment is invaluable, someone added fresh paint to change a compositional detail. The critics asked a simple question. If the decision was based on fragments of red paint in a distressed section of the mural, why did those fragments contradict every early copy of the painting made before the damage occurred? And more uncomfortably, if one detail was altered during restoration, which others were. Now, here is something the restoration debaters never fully addressed. As of the most recent scholarly estimates, less than 20% of what you see on that wall today is original paint by Leonardo da Vinci. Some estimates put the surviving original even lower. The painting that tourists stand in front of, the painting considered one of the great treasures of human civilization, the painting that sells out months in advance and limits visitors to 15 minutes and requires advance booking as though it were surgery, is mostly not Leonardo's paint. It is 5 centuries of other people's attempts to preserve or reproduce what he made. The actual work Leonardo created is underneath, fragmentary, damaged, surrounded by restoration layers applied by people who could not see it properly, sitting on a wall that has been bombed, flooded, used as a stable by Napoleon's soldiers, and had a door carved through its center. And beneath that, buried in the chemistry of the primer layer itself, is a lead oxide compound that Leonardo used secretly and never documented, a compound so advanced that no other Italian Renaissance painter is known to have used it. Underneath the visible painting is a different painting. Underneath that painting are primer layers containing chemistry Leonardo deliberately concealed. And around all of it is a perspective system engineered with mathematical precision that modern software still finds extraordinary. The question researchers keep returning to is not whether Leonardo was clever. Nobody debates that. The question is why a man who documented virtually everything left such specific technical choices completely undocumented. Why he used a method guaranteed to decay when he understood exactly why it would decay. Why he chose to work slowly on something unstable rather than quickly on something that would last. Why the most geometrically significant section of the mural is also the section that was physically destroyed. Why the AI reconstruction anomalies cluster most densely in the most damaged region of a painting that was already dying before Leonardo finished it. There's a possible explanation that sounds dramatic until you actually think it through carefully. Leonardo lived in a world where the church controlled the definition of acceptable truth. He dissected human corpses in secret because official doctrine had complicated relationships with anatomy. He wrote his notebooks in mirror script, a habit that has never been fully explained. He was investigated by Florentine authorities in 1476 for reasons that were never publicly specified, and the charges were eventually dropped. He spent his adult life navigating between what he observed and what he was permitted to say he observed. He understood the consequences of expressing ideas that church authority found threatening. He watched what happened to people who said the wrong things in the wrong places. If he wanted to preserve ideas that could not safely be spoken aloud in 1497, a painting commissioned by a duke and installed in a convent would have been the last place anyone would look for them. Books could be burned, manuscripts could be seized, letters could be intercepted. But a mural embedded in the wall of a working religious institution, one that the church itself valued and protected, would survive, probably for centuries. And if those preserved ideas were structured in layers, visible only to someone who knew what to look for, who had the right tools, who applied the right kind of analysis, they would remain invisible until humanity developed the capability to find them. The strangest thing about all of this is not any individual discovery. It is the accumulation, the deliberate choice of unstable materials, the toxic hidden chemistry no one was told about, the faces that were changed by people who came after, the destroyed section at the geometrically most important location, the perspective system of almost engineered precision, the AI reconstruction outputs that keep clustering in the same places under repeated analysis, the fact that less than a fifth of the original paint survives, the fact that we have been analyzing this painting intensely for 5 centuries, and it still produces new findings every few years, and the fact that the man who made it seemed to understand, on some level, that it would outlast him by centuries, that it would survive things he could not predict, that eventually, at some point far beyond his own era, the people looking at it would have tools he could not imagine. Tools capable of separating light into spectra he could never have seen. Tools capable of detecting chemistry invisible to the naked eye. Tools capable of reconstructing geometry from fragments. He was right. We have those tools now. We are pointing them at the wall in Milan. And the wall is not giving up everything. What we know for certain is this. The faces were changed. The original Christ is not what generations of people looked at. The chemistry underneath the visible surface contains compounds Leonardo used secretly and never wrote about. The perspective is engineered to a mathematical precision that researchers still find hard to explain as purely aesthetic. A critical section was destroyed in 1652 before modern analysis could reach it. And today, less than 20% of Leonardo's original paint survives on that wall, surrounded by the interventions of people who were trying to preserve something they could not fully understand. What we do not know is whether those things are connected. Whether the deliberate unstable method and the secret chemistry and the precise geometry in the destroyed section are all part of something that was designed to be found. or whether 5 centuries of decay, alteration, and restoration have simply produced a painting so damaged that any pattern we find in it says more about what we are looking for than what Leonardo put there. That uncertainty is the most honest place to stand. Not conspiracy, not dismissal. Uncertainty. Because the evidence for something deliberate is real and documented and published in peer-reviewed journals. And the evidence that we cannot fully interpret what we are finding is equally real. Leonardo da Vinci painted this mural knowing it would decay. He used chemistry he never documented. He engineered a perspective system of extraordinary precision. He painted faces that later hands changed. He chose a method that created layers, and he produced something that 500 years later, modern machine intelligence is still finding new things inside. Whether he intended all of that or none of it, the result is the same. The wall in Milan is still talking, and we are only just beginning to listen closely enough to hear it.